Welcome to Live the Dream with yours truly, Marty Kaiser. Buckle up and let's get started. Happy Friday, everyone. This is Marty Kaiser with another episode of our Real Estate Tidbits podcast. Hope everyone's looking forward to the weekend, and everybody take care of their moms this weekend. Spoil her, take her out to eat, or whatever she wants to do. In my family, we'll probably have a chill day at home, but we'll probably go out for breakfast or something like that, and then I'll probably grill some food on the grill. But anyway, we're kind of boring. But anyway, enjoy your parents and appreciate them. Getting back to real estate, what's going on in real estate? Well, it's kind of interesting because I run into different situations every day relating to unique agents that I interact with. Of course, each customer has their own set of criteria and their own personality. So one thing I quickly learned in this business is that each situation is an individual entity unto itself. Well, what does that gobbledygook verbiage mean? Well, that means that everybody has different requirements, different what I call hot buttons, different things that are very important to them, different things that may bother them. They have different requirements, different tastes, different personalities. In Florida, you have a tremendous large melting pot, so you have a lot of different languages being spoken. And the thing with doing business in the 21st century, especially for people in a earlier or younger age group, is that texting is the predominant way to communicate. And while texting is great in the sense that it's quick, it's easy, and you can kind of multitask while you're doing it, which I know a lot of people do, texting has its disadvantages, especially in a real estate transaction. Why does it have challenges? Well, there's some things, in my opinion, being from old school, that need to be discussed over the telephone to ensure that there is no miscommunications. I always follow up any communications that are important with a written email because I like written documentation, again, to eliminate any miscommunications or someone saying, well, that's not what happened. I try to have it all documented in an email. But I always have preceded that typically with a phone call. And I find that a lot of people just like texting. It's very challenging sometimes to reach people on the telephone. A lot of age groups, for their own reasons, don't like talking on the telephone. And especially in the Central Florida area, when you do have different languages spoken sometimes the meaning of things may be misinterpreted. And in a real estate transaction, that can be really crucial. So it's important to have a clear, concise communication stream. And so I'm probably anal about that, but I try to minimize any unusual situations. When I get involved in a real estate transaction, I want it to close as smoothly as I can, with everybody being satisfied and happy with the result, and try to minimize excess work, excess stress, excess hard feelings. So I go to the utmost to accomplish that. And there's a lot of different issues that come up in real estate. You know, whether it's negotiating the contract, whether it's inspection issues, whether it's financing issues, whether it's potential repairs and how the repairs are being done. You might have permitting issues. There's just a lot of components that are not always anticipated. So I always have taken the position, besides what I'm chatting about today about communication, that I try to be proactive, meaning that I try to have all my ducks in a row and try to foresee if there's any potential issues in a transaction and try to address them at the beginning of the transaction, not at the end of the transaction. What's an example of that? Well, for those of us who have been in real estate for a number of years, probably starting about 10 or 12 years ago, give or take, in Orange County, they updated their tax appraiser's website or their county website where you get a lot of your real estate information. And one of the things they did was you could start seeing permitting, like what permits were pulled for what type of activity. For example, if you got a new roof on your house, if you got electrical work done, things of that nature. So you could pull up a property and see the history of the improvements that had permits pulled for them. Now, unfortunately, there are some people that do improvements and they don't pull permits, which is against code in many cases, but that's for another conversation. But my basic intent in discussing this is what we as real estate agents can verify. So one thing that happened shortly after this conversion, where there were a lot of expired or incomplete permits, and frequently they might have been as old as 20, 25 years. It was really eye-opening to me on a lot of the new homes that had been constructed in the 90s and 2000s, how many builders did not close out permits. And it mainly had to do with subcontractors, because most of your national builders that you're familiar with, they have a bunch of contractors they hire. They'll get a plumbing company, they'll get an electrical company, they'll get a roofing company, they'll get a plumbing company, they'll get an air conditioning company. So all those subcontractors obviously specialize in their field, and when they make significant changes or additions or install things, they have to go through a permitting process. And when they finished installing it, they have to get a final inspection, get the county to sign off that the work was done properly and safely and met all the building codes in Orange County. And then they close out that permit or put the word complete. But over the years, and especially during this transition period when it was all newer, there were a ton of permits that weren't done properly. So unfortunately, the county, in their infinite wisdom, placed closing these permits out on the current seller of the property, assuming they were selling their home. And often these permits that weren't closed out properly were done before this particular owner purchased the property. But because when they purchased the property, checking permits was not part of the process through title companies or law offices, the onus fell on, of course, the listing agent and the seller to close out these permits. So in some instances, it was a fairly simple process. In other instances, it was more involved. And I won't bore you with the details of how we go about closing permits out. The reason I bring this up from a communication standpoint and trying to minimize problems closer to closing is that before I go out on a listing appointment where somebody's called me and says, hey, I'm thinking of selling my house, I'd like you to come out and chat with me about what you can do to sell my house, what kind of pricing strategy you have, what kind of marketing strategy you have, and all the other services that a customer would expect of me if they hire me to sell their house. So one of the things that I do, besides doing all my pricing and marketing evaluation of that property, is I go into the county records and pull permits. So not only does it let me see what things have been added over the years, but it lets me see if there are any open permits. And so when I go out and meet with the people, at some point during my interfacing with my customers, I go over the permits that are open, if they have any. And of course, they're completely perplexed by this because frequently the permits weren't pulled, or not pulled, the permits weren't checked, because they bought the house before this transition in Orange County took place. And of course, a lot of times they'd say, well, that wasn't done during my ownership, and that was done 20 years ago. There was different things that took place. So, of course, these people not only were perplexed, but a little aggravated. And then they wanted to know why this wasn't done prior to them buying the home. And I had to explain also that the process changed. So, unfortunately, we can't avoid that. And so the reason I pull the permits out before I meet with them is to inform and educate them and explain to them what we'll need to do to close the permit out. Frequently, I'm able to close it out on my own due to some information I've gained over the years from how to best work with the Orange County Permitting Department. But other times, they might take a more rigid position depending on what type of permit it was. And they might want a new permit pulled and the property to be re-inspected. That's when it can become quite a hassle, because some of the building codes have changed, especially like with swimming pools, etc. And so some of the times it can be a nuisance. And of course, you got to go through all that, and there's a fee to pull the new permit. And many times the subcontractor that didn't properly do their job is either not in business any longer, or if they're in business but it's so old and you contact that subcontractor, they might not be willing to do what they should have done 15 years ago. So anyway, it is what it is. But I try to, that's just an explanation of me doing things on the front end of things to eliminate problems, stress, and time pressure on the back end of things. And I take a lot of pride in trying to do those type of activities to minimize the aggravation and uncalled for issues that would come up toward the tail end of the thing. So that's just, one example of that. The reason that this is fresh in my mind, I've got a couple of transactions that are recent and new transactions. And some of the communications with the other agent have been a little bit more challenging because everybody has a different way to do things, but sometimes one party may have a way to do things that's probably not exactly in line with how it should be done, or maybe there's just a misunderstanding of things, and sometimes due to either a language barrier, or maybe that particular agent is almost impossible to reach by telephone, and then trying to conduct some of these nuanced issues via text is a little bit more challenging. So it's just interesting, and my philosophy has always been, besides what I've always shared with you, I don't want to waste anybody's time, my own time, customers that I'm working with, the other agent. And if we can do something in 10 minutes, it's a lot easier to do it that way than have extended back and forth due to a lack of communication, and something that may take all of a sudden, 4 or 5 times you have to reach out with a person. Who knows how much time has elapsed? And then you might start getting one side or the other aggravated about the procedure. So it's just a lot easier to, like I said, try to really affect your communication in a positive manner. And the other day, for example, I had a call from an investor from out of state, and they were an investor that buys a lot of properties. And so they were looking for an agent that they felt comfortable with, that could represent all their interest after they've renovated the home, to place it on the market. And there's a lot of that type of activity in the Orlando area, because this is a popular area. A lot of our houses are starting to get a little bit older, and there's a lack of inventory in certain price ranges, especially in your more, what I would call your moderate price ranges, like in the $200,000 to $300,000 range. There's a lack of inventory. So these investors seek out opportunities, whether it's a distress sale or whether they're bidding on horses through the foreclosure system, through the county courthouse. There's different ways that they try to secure these properties. And then they're all fix and flippers, basically. They all have a different philosophy on how much money they're going to put into a property. But, they're going to improve the property. They're going to repaint it. They may change the flooring. They may update the kitchens. It just depends on what kind of shape the property's in and how much money they're willing to spend and what type of profit margin they're anticipating. And, of course, what price do they acquire the property at? They have pretty strict guidelines on how much below market value they're willing to pay for it, because once they purchase it and pay the various selling expenses and then pay for the renovation, they want to have a certain return on their investment. So it's a process. The reason I bring this up, this particular gentleman had a nice chat with him. And of course, he was looking for someone like myself that was quite experienced, knew the areas, knew how to effectively market it. But they also wanted somebody to supervise the renovations. And they also, because they're supposedly dealing in more volume, they wanted to compensate us on a significantly discounted basis. So those things are all understandable from their perspective. From my perspective, or the broker's perspective, I've got to evaluate the credibility of the investor. I've got to evaluate how much time, effort, and expertise are they going to expect of me to put into each particular home that they would hire me to represent their interest, and how much they're willing to compensate me, and is that worthwhile for me? My business philosophy has always been, regardless of what my role in a transaction is, it's got to be a win-win situation. If I'm working with the seller, well, then the person that's going to buy their property has to think it's a fair arrangement. And if I'm working with an entity like this investor, they have certain cost requirements. But at the same time, if I'm going to put in a lot of time, effort, and expertise, what they're compensating me has to be feasible. Because everybody's time is a precious entity. You only have so many hours in the day to work. And if you're good at what you do, you expect to be compensated fairly for that. And obviously, there's a lot of people that would rather get the top of the expertise, but they don't want to pay for it. And, there's never as what I would refer to as a free lunch, and you never get something for nothing. So it's got to be a win-win situation. So if it's not a win-win situation where the investor's expecting me to do all these various tasks, but their compensation is just not in line with what I think is equitable, we will part as friends, but we'll move on. When I'm dealing with a more standard seller or buyer, again, the same philosophy takes place. You'll find realtors, their fees may vary from one agent to the next. But what you have to determine as the consumer is how much expertise does that agent bring you? How are their results been? Not only have they sold or represented a bunch of buyers or sellers successfully throughout the years, but are they getting top dollar for their properties? Are they completing the transaction in a pretty stress-free manner? Are they able to work efficiently on behalf of their customers so that if it's a seller, they're able to sell it quickly but get top dollar? If it's a buyer, are they showing the buyer the kind of houses that a buyer is expecting to see based on the communication that the buyer and the agent had, so that the agent has a good understanding of what the buyer's needs are, what their budget is, what the location requirements are? And at the same time, that agent showing the buyer what the buyer wants to see, not what the agent's trying to sell them. I never try to sell my opinions or feelings. I'm trying to follow the buyer's requirements, tastes, and needs. I'll give the buyer my opinion when it's asked for. If they're getting a good value, what do I think are the pros and cons of that property, etc. But it's a science, and so some people's efforts are more appreciated than others. And so when people tell me, well, I can get Harry Jones, he'll help me in this real estate transaction, and they quote me a really low fee that Harry's doing, I say, well, what are his credentials? How many properties has he sold? What kind of skills does he bring into the table? And more often than not, I see one or more of the following. He or she hasn't sold that much. They're not doing a lot of things. They're not really bringing value to the transaction. So it's important for the agent to communicate what skills and services are bringing to the transaction. So I know I kind of jumped around a little bit, but the point of this podcast was to talk about not only services rendered, but effective communication and what can go into various real estate transactions. There's a lot of components. But if you take anything out of this transaction, it's you must effectively and regularly communicate. If you don't, it just makes life a lot harder. Last but not least, we'll give you a quick 60-second update on the NBA playoffs. They've continued to be kind of befuddling. The Boston Celtics, who were overwhelming favorites against the New York Knicks, lost 2 games that were closely contested games, that were home games for the Celtics, and the Celtics were overwhelming favorites in this series. The Celtics have pretty much self-destructed. They've had 20-point leads in both games and lost them both at the end, and they were both home games. So now they're going back to New York, so it should be interesting. But if the Knicks beat the Celtics, it'll be an upset of epic proportions. The Cleveland Cavaliers are kind of in the same shape. They blew their first 2 games to the Indiana Pacers, so we'll see how their series progresses. On the western side of the ledger, the Golden State Warriors and Minnesota Timberwolves are tied at 1-1. The unfortunate thing in that series is Stephen Curry, who is by far their star player, leader, the most important player. He's injured his hamstring, so he's going to miss probably a minimum of 3 games in this series. And that may very well be the difference, because without Stephen Curry in the lineup, it's going to be hard for Golden State to beat Minnesota. And the other series is Oklahoma City, and they're playing, who are they playing? I'm drawing a brain freeze here. Oh, they're playing the Denver Nuggets. And the Denver Nuggets upset them in game 1, but then Oklahoma City came back and had an overwhelming, I think they won by about 40 points in game 2. So I expect the Oklahoma City to get control of that series and probably beat Denver in 6 games. But those are all good series, so I highly recommend, if you're a basketball fan, go ahead and watch them. So that's all for today. Everybody have a great and awesome Mother's Day. Hopefully the weather will cooperate. Stay safe and healthy. This is Marty Kaiser out.